9. Federal Indian boarding school system conditions. Despite differences in operation, management, and funding, the United States recognized that the federal Indian boarding school system was central to Indian territorial dispossession and Indian assimilation. Often using active or decommissioned military sites, federal Indian boarding schools were designed to separate a child from his reservation and family, strip him of his tribal lore and mores, force the complete abandonment of his native language, and prepare him for never again returning to his people. As a result, the United States applied systematic, militarized, and identity alteration methodologies in the federal Indian boarding school system to assimilate American Indian, Alaska Native, and Native Hawaiian children through education. In 1902, Commissioner of Indian Affairs William A. Jones described the main goal of applying systematic, militarized, and identity alteration methodologies in the federal Indian boarding school system as follows. The young of the wild bird, though born in captivity, naturally retains the instincts of freedom so strong in the parent and beats the bars to secure it, while after several generations of captivity, the young bird will return to the cage after a brief period of freedom. So with the Indian child. The first wild redskin placed in the school chafes at the loss of freedom and longs to return to his wildwood home. His offspring retains some of the habits acquired by the parent. These habits receive fresh development in each successive generation, fixing new rules of conduct, different aspirations, and greater desires to be in touch with the dominant race. Generations of Indian children, separate and together, experienced the federal Indian boarding school system, which Congress recognized was run in a rigid military fashion with heavy emphasis on rustic vocational education. The children are improved rather in their habits than in what they learn from books. For example, to teach them obedience and cleanliness and give them a better carriage. Department records detail examples of organizing Indian male children into companies as soldiers and the best material selected for sergeants and corporals. They have been uniformed and drilled in many of the movements of Army tactics. As late as 1917, the department course of study for Indian schools included military and gymnastic exercises for an hour, 2 or 3 times per week in grades 4 through 6, pre-vocational, and in grades 6 through 10, vocational. Children in federal Indian boarding schools had their 24 hours so systematized that there is little opportunity to exercise any power of choice. For example, the curriculum for first grade students across the federal Indian boarding school system in 1917 included the following. Boarding schools. The time assigned to a subject indicates its relative importance. First grade. General exercises, 25 minutes. Assembly, once each week. Music, once each week. Manners and right conduct, once each week. Current events, once each week. English, 110 minutes. Conversational and other oral exercises. History, health, numbers, nature study. Reading and writing exercises. Writing and drawing, alternate, 20 minutes. Breathing exercises, 10 minutes. Industrial work, 240 minutes. Small and young pupils should not be required to work full-time. Physical training, 60 minutes. Evening hour, 60 minutes. Little folks, free play. Adults, miscellaneous exercises. Meals, free time, extra detail, 6 hours, 15 minutes. Sleep, 9 to 10 hours for little folks. Systematic identity alteration methodologies employed by federal Indian boarding schools included renaming Indian children from Indian names to different English names, cutting the hair of Indian children, requiring the use of military or other standard uniforms as clothes, and discouraging or forbidding the following in order to compel them to adopt Western practices and Christianity. 1. Using Indian languages. 2. Conducting cultural practices. And 3. Exercising their religions. When first brought in, they are a hard-looking set, Their long, tangled hair is shorn close, and they are stripped of their Indian garb, thoroughly washed and clad in civilized clothing. The metamorphosis is wonderful, and the little savage seems quite proud of his appearance. Teaching the young Indian child to speak English is essentially the first step in his training, and special attention has been directed to giving him a working knowledge of the language in the shortest possible time. No Indian is spoken. There is not an Indian pupil whose tuition and maintenance is paid for by the United States government who is permitted to study any other language than our own vernacular, the language of the greatest, most powerful, and enterprising nationalities beneath the sun. For some Indian tribes and Alaska Native villages, the federal Indian boarding school system was not the first systematic language discouragement or prevention experience. For example, the department has recognized that for the Indian pueblos in New Mexico, a large number of them understand and speak the Spanish language, and only the young, now being educated in the industrial schools, understand and speak English. Indian boarding school rules were often enforced through punishment, including corporal punishment such as solitary confinement, flogging, withholding food, whipping, slapping, or cuffing. At times, rule enforcement was a group experience. For the first offense, unless a serious one, a reprimand before the school is far better than a dozen whippings, because one can teach the whole school that the offender has done something that is wrong, and they all know it and will remember it, while it is humiliating to the offender and answers better than whipping. Federal Indian boarding schools also conducted discipline at times by making older children to punish younger children. When offenses have been serious enough to demand corporal punishment, the cases have generally been submitted to a court of the older pupils, and this has proved a most satisfactory method. Describing the practice of trying boys guilty of any serious offense by a court-martial, using the older and more intelligent as a court, the department has acknowledged the members of the court-martial are detailed from the cadet officers, care being taken to secure an impartial selection from various tribes. Charges are preferred against the prisoner. The court examines witnesses, hears the defense, fixes the degree of guilt, and recommends a punishment. The department has later observed Indian school children lived under strict discipline that not only failed to accomplish its purpose of moral training, but in many cases contributed to an attitude of conflict with authority of any sort. Initial analysis demonstrates a trend of Indian children escaping and running away from federal Indian boarding schools. The children who have run away from school have been promptly brought back and punished, and judicious punishment has, in all instances, proved very salutary. For example, the department has recognized that at the Kickapoo boarding school in Kansas, runaways, both boys and girls, were frequent during the first half of the year. Corporal punishment was resorted to, and the habit, being of long standing, was not entirely overcome. But I am convinced that a prompt returning of the runaways and a whipping administered soundly and prayerfully helps greatly toward bringing about the desired result. The department has acknowledged, frankly and unequivocally, that the provisions for the care of the Indian children in boarding schools are grossly inadequate. Rampant physical, sexual, and emotional abuse, disease, malnourishment, overcrowding, and lack of health care in Indian boarding schools are well documented. For example, the department has documented the accommodations in select federal Indian boarding schools as follows. White Earth Boarding School, Minnesota, 1 bed to 2 pupils. Kickapoo Boarding School, Kansas, 3 children to each bed. Rainy Mountain Boarding School, Oklahoma, single beds pushed so closely together to preclude passage between them, and each bed has 2 or more occupants. The department has recognized infrastructure deficiencies in the federal Indian boarding school system. The boarding schools are crowded materially beyond their capacities. A device frequently resorted to in an effort to increase dormitory capacity without great expense is the addition of large sleeping porches. They are in themselves reasonably satisfactory, but they shut off light and air from the inside rooms, which are still filled with beds beyond their capacity. The toilet facilities have, in many cases, not been increased proportionately to the increase in pupils, and they are fairly frequently not properly maintained or conveniently located. The supply of soap and towels has been inadequate. Poor diets, high in starch and sugar and low in fresh fruits and vegetables, were common in the federal Indian boarding school system. The outstanding deficiency is in the diet furnished the Indian children, many of whom are below normal health. The department has recognized the poor quality water supply as well in federal Indian boarding schools. Still, in some circumstances, the department has acknowledged that conditions in the federal Indian boarding school system progressed. For example, in 1897, it recognized that in the great majority of schools, the individual towel, comb, hairbrush, and toothbrush have displaced the social use of these toilet articles. And in federal Indian boarding schools in 1897, started to transition from coal oil lamps to electricity for lighting. The federal government has held that the infrastructure deficiencies of the federal Indian boarding school system in part are characteristic of turning over for school use abandoned forts and other government property. There is almost never any real economy in this practice. Military plants usually date from long before the modern period of lighting, ventilation, and conveniences, and they are often poor construction, necessitating continued and expensive repair bills. The department has found in turn that it may be seriously questioned whether the Indian service could do very much better than it does without more adequate appropriations. From the point of view of education, the Indian service is almost literally a starved service. 9.1. Use of child labor as curricula and in response to deficient conditions. The labor of Indian children as carried on in Indian boarding schools would, it is believed, constitute a violation of child labor laws in most states. Merriam Report, made at the request of the Secretary of the Interior, 1928. The federal Indian boarding school system focused on vocational training involving manual labor of Indian children, to furnish Indian boys and girls with a type of education that would be practical and cost little. The government years ago adopted for the boarding schools a half-time plan whereby pupils spend half the school day in academic subjects and the remaining half in work about the institution. Federal records indicate that as practical education is what the Indian most requires, the federal Indian boarding school system limited textbook instruction. In 1902, the Commissioner of Indian Affairs described that to educate the Indian is to prepare him for the abolishment of tribal relations, to take his land in severalty and in the sweat of his brow and by the toil of his hands, to carve out, as his white brother has done, a home for himself and his family. The federal government embraced the policy of giving to industrial training the foremost place in Indian education. In addition to well-documented livestock and poultry raising, dairying, and Western agriculture production, including for sales outside the federal Indian boarding school system, Indian children at federal Indian boarding schools engaged in other manual labor practices, including but not limited to the following: lumbering, working on the railroad, including on the road and in-car shops, carpentering, blacksmithing, fertilizing, irrigation system development, well digging, making furniture, including mattresses, tables, and chairs, cooking, laundry, and ironing services, and garment making, including for themselves and other children in the federal Indian boarding schools. For example, the department has acknowledged that in 1857 at the Winnebago Manual Labor Schools, Nebraska, the Winnebago girls have made 550 garments for themselves and the boys attending the school, and some 700 sacks for the use of the farm. The department later acknowledged that in 1903, at the Mescalero Boarding School, New Mexico, the Mescalero Apache boys sawed over 70,000 feet of lumber and 40,000 shingles, and made upward of 120,000 brick. Manual labor provided by Indian children in the federal Indian boarding school system included provisions of education services to other Indian children. Indeed, the department found that 3, the amount of English language drill may be secured by having 1 or 2 of the more advanced pupils act as a teacher, and at the same time, instruction to older pupils can be given in another part of the room. Congress has also codified that the Commissioner of Indian Affairs shall employ Indian girls as assistant matrons and Indian boys as farmers and industrial teachers in all Indian schools where it is practical to do so. The manual labor practices employed in the federal Indian boarding school system varied at end. At the turn of the 19th century, the department formed a uniform curriculum for the federal Indian boarding school system. The time assigned to a subject indicates its relative importance. The pre-vocational division of the system refers to grades 1 through 6. The vocational division refers to additional 1 through 4 grades after 6, grades 7 through 10. The curriculum included that, for the pre-vocational division, Indian children in grades 1 through 6 were assigned 4 hours to industrial work. The curriculum included that, for the vocational division, Indian children in grades 1 through 4, grades 7 through 10, were assigned 4 hours to industrial work. The course has been planned with the vocational aim very clearly and positively dominant, with a special emphasis on agriculture and homemaking. Later in 1928, the department observed that whatever may have once been the case, Indian children are now coming into the boarding schools much too young for heavy institutional labor. Concerning on-reservation federal Indian boarding schools, the department noted, "The children are conspicuously small." For example, the department documented the intersection between manual labor and younger children at the Loop Boarding School Day School, Arizona, which primarily served children from the Navajo Nation. 100 of the 191 girls are 11 years age or under. The result is that the institutional work, instead of being done wholly by able-bodied youths of 15 to 20, nominally enrolled in the early grades, has to be done, in part at least, by very small children, moreover, who, according to competent medical opinion, are malnourished. The department has explained the need for Indian child manual labor in the federal Indian boarding school system as follows. In our Indian schools, a large amount of productive work is necessary. They could not possibly be maintained on the amounts appropriated by Congress for their support were it not for the fact that students are required to do the washing, ironing, baking, cooking, sewing, to care for the dairy, farm, garden, grounds, buildings, etc., an amount of labor that has in the aggregate a very appreciable monetary value. At the Haskell Institute, Kansas, for instance, the children were encouraged to enjoy the work. The children were carefully instructed in the cultivation of strawberries, and under proper supervision were allowed to gather the fruit and enjoy strawberry suppers. If the labor of the boarding school is to be done by the pupils, it is essential that the pupils be old enough and strong enough to do institutional work. The economic contribution of Indian and Native Hawaiian children to the federal Indian boarding school system and beyond remains unknown.